Today, we will be looking at 14 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Each story starts with confidence, but ends in chaos. One wrong turn, one mistake, one moment underground, and everything turns into unimaginable terror. As always, viewer discretion is advised. February 7th, 1988. Three divers arrived at Orange Grove Sink in Suwannee County, Florida, on a Sunday morning. The sink was a typical Florida cave system, a vertical shaft dropping into limestone, opening into chambers and passages carved by underground water over millennia. Clear water, interesting geology, and the thrill of exploring underwater passages drew divers to these systems despite the inherent dangers. John Gilligan, 18 years old, was the most enthusiastic about the dive. He had achieved his PADI Advanced Open Water Certification, a level that indicated he had completed additional training beyond basic open water diving. Over an 18-month period, he had logged 20 dives. That number might sound substantial to a non-diver, but in the diving community, 20 dives represents limited experience. More significantly, Gilligan had no cavern certification and no cave certification, the specialized training required for safe overhead environment diving. His equipment reflected his limited experience and preparation. He carried a single 80 cubic foot, 11.1 liter tank, the standard recreational scuba tank. No octopus regulator, meaning no redundant air source if his primary regulator failed. A single light, a UK 500, a decent underwater light, but representing a single point of failure if it malfunctioned. In cave diving, the rule is 3 lights minimum: primary, backup, and emergency backup. Gilligan had one. The 3 divers entered Orange Grove Sink and descended into the lower cavern. The passage opened up from the entrance shaft into larger chambers, the limestone walls disappearing into darkness beyond their light's range. The water was clear initially, visibility extending for significant distances, allowing them to see the passages branching off in different directions. They made a decision that would prove fatal. They used no guideline. In cave diving, a continuous guideline to the surface is not optional. It's the fundamental safety protocol that separates cave diving from open water diving. The guideline marks your route in, provides tactile reference and zero visibility, and offers a physical connection to the exit when disorientation strikes. Gilligan led the group deeper into the cave system. His enthusiasm and confidence pushed them forward, exploring, seeking whatever lay beyond the visible passages. They encountered 2 major constrictions at the bottom of the cavern, tight spots where the passage narrowed dramatically, requiring careful body positioning and controlled breathing to pass through without disturbing the fine silt that coated every surface. Gilligan navigated through both constrictions, his companions following. They emerged into a small chamber beyond the second restriction. The chamber was unremarkable, just another void in the limestone, offering no particularly interesting features or passages leading to Verge Cave. Gilligan made the assessment that there was nothing here worth the risk of continuing and decided to turn the dive. He pulled out his slate, an underwater writing board that divers use to communicate when verbal communication is impossible. He wrote a message to his companion: "Nothing here, let's leave." The decision to exit was sound. They had penetrated deep into the cave, passed through 2 constrictions, and found nothing particularly interesting. Time to head back to the entrance and the surface. But the exit would be far more difficult than the entry had been. The 3 divers had disturbed silt during their inbound journey. Fin kicks near the floor, bodies brushing against walls, movements through the constrictions. In open water, disturbed sediment disperses quickly in current. But in caves with minimal water flow, silt behaves differently. It hangs suspended in the water column, reducing visibility from tens of feet to inches within seconds. The disturbance they had created going in was now waiting for them on the way out. Gilligan's companion began backing out of the chamber, moving carefully, trying to retrace their route, but the visibility was already gone. The water that had been clear was now totally silted, a brown murk that absorbed light, made navigation impossible, transformed familiar passages into alien environments where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The companion managed to back out despite the conditions. Perhaps they moved slowly enough to avoid creating additional silt disturbance. They successfully retraced their route through the silted passages and emerged back into clearer water. Gilligan made a different decision. Instead of backing out the way they had come, retracing the known route through the two constrictions, he decided to ascend vertically. But this wasn't open water. This was a cave system with complex three-dimensional geometry. Going up didn't necessarily lead to the exit. It might lead to a dead-end pocket in the ceiling. It might lead to a restriction too tight to pass. It might lead nowhere. As he moved up, he saw there was a vertical hole which seemed passable. Gilligan entered the tight vertical hole, his body ascending into the constriction. The hole was barely passable, requiring precise body positioning. His single 80 cubic foot tank contained a finite amount of breathing gas, and he had already consumed a significant portion during the inbound journey and exploration. Every breath depleted his remaining supply. Every moment spent navigating the tight vertical passage brought him closer to the moment when he would draw on his regulator and get nothing. That moment came while he was still in the constriction. Gilligan ran out of air. The gauge would have been in the red zone for minutes, warning him that he was approaching empty. Then came the increasingly difficult draws on the regulator as the tank pressure dropped. Finally, the moment when he inhaled and got no resistance. The tank was empty. There was no air left, and he was still stuck in a tight vertical hole 120 feet, 37 meters, below the surface in a silted-out cave. Without air, panic set in immediately. The instinct to breathe is overwhelming. You can hold your breath for a limited time, but eventually your body demands air. Gilligan tried to continue ascending through the constriction, trying to reach whatever lay above, hoping desperately that it led to the surface, or at least to a pocket of trapped air where he could breathe. But the constriction was too tight, his movements too panicked, his body unable to navigate the geometry of the rock with the precision required. He became stuck and simply ran out of time. The urge to breathe became irresistible. When he finally could hold his breath no longer, he inhaled water instead of air. The water filled his lungs, triggering violent coughing that only pulled more water in. Within minutes, he was unconscious. Within a few more minutes, he was dead, stuck in a tight vertical hole, his UK 500 light still burning, marking the location of his body in the darkness. His companions surfaced without him. They waited for him to emerge, growing more and more concerned as minutes passed. Eventually, they realized that he was still down there and wasn't coming back. They notified authorities immediately, providing what information they could about where they had been in the cave and where they had last seen Gilligan. A recovery team was assembled. Experienced cave divers who regularly performed body recoveries were contacted and responded to Orange Grove Sink. The survivors provided directions through the entrance shaft, down to the lower cavern, through two major constrictions, into a small chamber. The recovery divers prepared their equipment, reviewed the route description, and entered the cave system. They navigated through the passages, following the description provided by the survivors. When they reached the general area where Gilligan's body should be located, they tried an unusual technique. They turned off their lights. In the absolute darkness of the cave, with no lights to see by, they looked for any source of illumination, and there it was. A glow coming from above, from a tight vertical hole. Gilligan's UK 500 light was still burning, still producing its characteristic beam. The light that was supposed to guide him to safety had instead become a beacon marking where he had died. The recovery divers navigated to the glow, located Gilligan's body stuck in the vertical constriction at 120 feet, 37 meters depth, and began the difficult process of extraction. The recovery team successfully brought John Gilligan's body out of Orange Grove Sink later that day. The 18-year-old who had entered the water that morning, enthusiastic and confident, was carried to the surface and handed over to authorities. The analysis of Gilligan's death revealed a cascade of failures and poor decisions. He had entered a cave system without cave training or certification. He had used no guideline, eliminating the primary safety tool that prevents divers from becoming lost. He had carried inadequate equipment, single tank with no redundant air source, single light with no backup. He had led his companions deep into the system through 2 constrictions into a small chamber. When conditions became difficult due to silted visibility, he had made the fatal decision to attempt vertical ascent through an unknown tight hole rather than backing out the known route. If you've ever been cave diving in North Florida, or even just watched videos of it, you know the springs down there look like portals, crystal clear water, white limestone, and then, right where the sunlight is still dancing on the sand, the bottom of the world opens up. Today's story takes place at one of the most famous and most deceptively unforgiving cave systems in Florida, Devil's Ear Spring in Gilchrist County. It was Saturday, October 9th, 1994, and 2 experienced divers, R.D. Milholland and Alan Jonushaitis, pulled up to Devil's Ear with a plan that sounded casual on paper, but involved serious equipment. They were going to do a cave dive that included 2 stage tanks and Techna scooters, underwater propulsion vehicles that let you cover distance quickly in a cave. The dive itself was described as loosely structured, not reckless necessarily, but not rigid either. Their thinking was, let's keep navigation simple so we can focus on managing the stages and the scooters. So instead of taking any complex route, they decided they'd go up the unbroken main passage, the straightforward way. Now, if you're not a cave diver, you might hear main passage and think, okay, so it's basically a tunnel with one direction in and one direction out. But caves don't behave like that. Even the main line in a cave can have branches, features, restrictions, and moments where, if you're even slightly task-loaded, juggling gear, managing buoyancy, dealing with a scooter, checking stages, your brain can get behind the dive instead of ahead of it. Still, these 2 weren't just splashing in. They geared up, reviewed their plan, entered the water, and did secondary checks shortly after going in. The kind of detail-oriented step that suggests they were taking things seriously. And for the first part of the dive, things were fine. Until Milholland's scooter failed, right at the beginning. That kind of problem can change the entire personality of a dive. Because a scooter isn't just a convenience. It affects speed, timing, exertion, air consumption, and workload. It changes how you move and how you think. Milholland's scooter was done, but Alan still worked, and instead of calling the dive immediately, they decided to continue. Partly so Alan could practice with his scooter. Milholland would swim, Alan would scooter, and they'd proceed slowly. Not ideal, but manageable. They moved deeper into Devil's Ear, heading toward a feature with a name that sounds like it was invented by a cave trying to warn you. The Lips. In the cave diving world, the lips is a constriction, a tight, pinched section of passage that you have to thread through. Not necessarily a squeeze that crushes you, but the kind of restriction that forces you to stay controlled, maintain trim, and keep your gear from snagging or banging into the ceiling and walls. It's also the kind of place where your spacing matters, because if one diver goes through and the other diver has an issue right behind them, you don't always have room for 2 people to turn around, work a problem, and still keep it clean. As they approached the lips, everything still looked normal. They got to the constriction and exchanged OK signals. Milholland went first. He swam through the tight section, about 40 to 60 feet, steady and controlled. It wasn't instant. It took long enough that, behind him, Alan would have been watching his light disappear into the rock corridor. Milholland came out on the far side and turned back, expecting to see Alan's beam coming through. And he did. At first. Alan's light appeared and it moved in a controlled pattern. The kind of movement you see when someone is stable, following the line, handling themselves normally. Milholland watched that light for about a minute. Then it vanished. Not like it drifted away. Not like it faded because Alan turned his head. It was there, and then it was gone. In a cave, that kind of moment is like hearing a sentence cut off halfway through. Your brain tries to finish it. Your heart starts filling in worst-case endings. Milholland waited just a beat, a short pause, the kind you take when you're trying not to overreact. Then he turned around and swam back through the lips to see what happened. But when he got back to the other side, Alan wasn't there. No diver, no light, no bubbles, nothing. Just the cave, indifferent and silent. At this point, Milholland had a decision to make that every diver dreads. Do I keep searching deeper into uncertainty, or do I start exiting and get help? Searching in a cave without a clear idea of where the person is can turn one emergency into two, but leaving your partner behind feels unthinkable. Milholland moved toward the exit, and he wasn't just swimming away, he was scanning, trying to solve the puzzle in real time. Because if Alan wasn't behind him, then where did he go? The cave answered that question at the next major landmark. At a junction where a small branch passage leads toward Devil's Eye Spring, Milholland found him. Alan was in the side lead, not deep inside it, but enough that he wasn't in the main flow of traffic, enough that you could pass the junction and not immediately see him if you weren't looking perfectly. And Alan wasn't moving. He was positioned facing outward, toward the way out. And the detail that hit Milholland like a punch was this. Alan's regulator was not in his mouth. In cave diving, that image is horrifying in a very specific way. Because underwater, your regulator is your life. People don't casually remove it. They don't rest without it. If it's out, something is wrong, either physically, mentally, or mechanically. Milholland rushed to him and tried to pull him out. But Alan wasn't just wearing a simple setup. He still had the stage tanks attached, and his scooter. All that equipment that was supposed to make the dive more capable was now acting like an anchor. Milholland tried to maneuver him, to drag him free, to get him back into the main passage and moving, but the gear impeded everything. It caught, it resisted. It made Alan's body harder to control in the confined space. And in caves, time doesn't pass normally. It speeds up. Because every second you spend wrestling with equipment is air you're breathing, CO2 you're building, stress rising, visibility potentially degrading, and your own safety margin shrinking. Milholland did what he could, and then he committed to getting Alan out. He started moving toward the entrance, and this is where the story becomes almost unbearable. Because as they approached the area near the entrance, a place that in many caves has signage underwater to indicate you're nearing the no kidding zone, Milholland reached a point where he could see an underwater marker known as the stop sign. And near that stop sign, he saw something that felt like salvation. An instructor and a student were there, other divers, people who could help. Milholland flashed his light and signaled emergency. The instructor responded immediately. No hesitation, no confusion, just action. Together, they worked fast, stripping Alan of what was holding him back, removing his tanks and accessories, the bulk that was turning a rescue into a wrestling match. Then they pulled him toward the surface. Not far. Not some long, heroic tow through miles of darkness. They brought him up at a nearby entrance, so close that, in another reality, Alan might have broken the surface coughing and blinking, furious and embarrassed and alive. On the surface, there were people already present. A physician and an EMT were on the scene. They tried resuscitation. They did what you'd expect professionals to do when someone is pulled out unresponsive. But it didn't work. Alan Jonashadis was gone. And what makes this tragedy linger, what makes it stick in your throat, is the geography of it. He died only feet away from indirect surface light, almost within sight of the cave diving warning sign. That sign is famous at places like Devil's Ear because it's blunt. It tells you, essentially, if you don't have the right training, you will die here. But the sign can't tell you the more unsettling truth. Even if you do have the training, even if you're equipped, even if you're careful, the margin between normal dive and fatal chain of events can be paper thin. Because something small can happen first. A scooter failure, a slightly increased workload, a constriction that forces separation, a moment of confusion at a junction, a regulator out of the mouth, whether from panic, a medical event, disorientation, equipment snag, CO2 buildup, or something else that happened too fast to diagnose. And then suddenly the most dangerous thing in the cave isn't depth, it's time. The time it takes to notice something is wrong, the time it takes to turn around, the time it takes to find your partner, the time it takes to get help. In this case, help was there. Tragically, it was just there. A moment too late. If you've ever watched cave divers exit a spring, you know there's a strange psychological shift that happens near the end of a dive. The danger feels like it's over. The ceiling lifts. The water brightens. You can sense the open pool ahead, the surface, the air, the world. Divers call it seeing daylight, and it's often the moment people relax just a little too early. This story is about a man who never made it those last few hundred feet, and a friend who did everything humanly possible to save him, while the cave quietly ran out the clock. On February 16, 2002, a group of experienced cave divers entered Little River Spring, one of North Florida's most popular and deceptively complex cave systems. Little River looks benign from the surface. Clear water, gentle flow, easy access. But inside, it's a true cave environment, overhead rock, long penetrations, strong current, and multiple side passages that can complicate exits. Among the group that day were Pete Reagan, 55 years old, and Frank Murphy, 43. They weren't diving alone. Friends were with them, and the dive followed a normal, conservative plan. They entered the system and moved inward together. At a point known as the Dome Room, the group made a standard decision. They would turn the dive there and begin heading out. No emergencies, no issues, no warning signs. On the way out, the group naturally spread into smaller units. Two divers decided to make a brief side trip up Harper Tunnel, a known passage branching off the main route. Murphy and Reagan continued straight toward the entrance. Murphy in the lead, Reagan following behind. It was a simple configuration, common, safe. At least, that's how it should have been. They swam against the current, moving steadily toward daylight. The cave around them remained quiet. No silt clouds, no equipment trouble, no frantic movement. Then Murphy noticed something that made his stomach drop. Reagan wasn't there. At first, Murphy probably assumed something minor. A pause to adjust gear, a brief stop at the line, maybe Reagan lagging slightly in the flow. But cave divers are trained to treat missing teammates seriously, immediately. Murphy turned around and swam back upstream. And about 40 feet behind him, he found Pete Reagan. Reagan was no longer swimming. His body was in full convulsions. Not small muscle spasms, not a tremor. His entire body was seizing uncontrollably. Arms, legs, torso. A violent neurological event unfolding underwater, in a cave. This is one of the most terrifying things a diver can encounter, because seizures underwater don't give warnings. There's no "I don't feel well" hand signal, no slow decline. One moment someone is fine, the next, their brain is misfiring and their body is no longer under their control. Murphy reacted instantly. He grabbed Reagan and managed to insert a regulator into Reagan's mouth. No small task when someone is convulsing. Jaw muscles clamp. The head moves unpredictably. Hands thrash. Murphy forced the regulator in and held it there. But Reagan was not breathing, so Murphy did the only thing left. He began forced ventilation, using the purge valve to push air into Reagan's lungs. This is an extreme measure. It's physically exhausting. It requires constant focus, and it's never guaranteed to work. At first, it seemed like it might. Reagan began breathing intermittently, short, irregular breaths, like his body was trying to remember how to function. Murphy started towing him toward the entrance. Every fin kick now had two purposes: move forward against the flow, keep Reagan alive. As they moved, Reagan would stop breathing again. Each time, Murphy had to stop, stabilize him, and force air into his lungs again. This wasn't a smooth rescue. It was start, stop, start, with Reagan slipping in and out of respiratory failure while Murphy fought the current and the cave. And all the while, Murphy's own air supply was ticking down. They were close, painfully close, only about 500 feet from the entrance when the incident began. A distance that normally feels trivial, but distance in a cave isn't measured in feet. It's measured in time, gas, and stress. As Murphy towed Reagan, ventilated him, restarted him again and again, his own breathing rate climbed. His exertion spiked. And then, about 30 feet before the entrance, Murphy's regulator went dry. He was out of air. Now the situation became almost unthinkable. Murphy was forced to switch to Reagan's air supply, sharing gas with a man who was unconscious, intermittently breathing, and moments from the surface. 30 feet. That's less than the length of a bus, but those 30 feet represented the most dangerous stretch of the entire dive. Murphy dragged Reagan the final distance. They broke out into the entrance area, where light fills the water and the ceiling opens into the spring pool. Other divers and surface support were already there. They saw what was happening and rushed in. Together, they pulled Reagan out of the water. On the surface, the fight continued. CPR was started immediately. Chest compressions, rescue breaths. Everything by the book. They worked on him until paramedics arrived. Then Reagan was transported to a hospital. But Pete Reagan never regained consciousness. The cause of the seizure was never definitively identified. No equipment failure. No clear medical diagnosis that could fully explain why, at that moment, just a few hundred feet from daylight, his brain shut down. He was pronounced dead. What makes this story especially difficult to process is how close to safety it unfolded. This wasn't a deep penetration accident miles from the entrance. This wasn't a diver lost in a maze. This wasn't a catastrophic collapse or entrapment. It was a sudden medical emergency, in the worst possible environment for one. Cave diving magnifies everything. A seizure on land is an emergency. A seizure underwater is a crisis. A seizure underwater in a cave becomes a race against physics itself. And Frank Murphy ran that race with everything he had. He recognized the emergency immediately, turned back without hesitation, controlled a convulsing diver, established an air source, performed forced ventilation underwater, towed Reagan against flow, continued rescue even after Reagan repeatedly stopped breathing, ran his own air supply down to zero, shared gas at the edge of blackout, and delivered Reagan to the surface alive. There are no mistakes to dissect here. No obvious wrong turns, no bad decisions. Just a reminder of something cave divers know, but never fully get comfortable with. You can do everything right and still lose. Medical events don't care about training levels. They don't care about proximity to exits. They don't care how experienced your teammate is. And caves, by their nature, allow no margin for the unexpected. Pete Reagan died in a place that thousands of divers have entered and exited safely. He died with a capable partner inches away. He died with air being forced into his lungs. He died almost at the surface. And that's what makes this story so haunting. Because if it can happen there, in clear water, near daylight, with help nearby, it can happen anywhere. And the only reason this isn't two fatalities is because one diver refused to let go until the very end. June 3rd, 2013, Morgan County, Alabama. Hughes Cave doesn't look like a place where you go to die. It doesn't have a massive, terrifying drop-off or a warning sign posted at the front. From the surface, it's just a modest, jagged opening in the Alabama limestone, tucked away in the woods of Morgan County. If you stand near the mouth, you can feel it breathing, a steady, cool draft of air flowing out from the belly of the earth. For decades, local cavers have treated this place like a playground. It's well mapped, it's familiar, and on a hot summer day, that 58-degree air feels like a gift. But caves are indifferent. They don't care how many times you've been inside. They are patient, and they wait for the one moment you stop paying attention. On June 3rd, Joseph Hockett went inside for what was supposed to be a routine trip. He wasn't looking for adventure or trying to break records. He was just part of a group, moving through the dark, enjoying the strange beauty of the underground. But by the time the night was over, he would be a prisoner of the mountain, sitting in a darkness so thick it felt like it had weight. The group started their trek into the cave with a simple plan. They'd navigate the main passages, see some of the formations, and head back out before dinner. In a cave like Hughes, it's easy to feel safe. There are no technical climbs that require ropes and harnesses. It's mostly walking and some light scrambling over rocks. Because of that, people tend to let their guard down. They stop looking at their compasses. They stop checking their watches. They just follow the person in front of them. As the group pushed deeper, the cave started to do what all caves do. It began to twist and turn, branching off into side tunnels that look exactly like the main path. The walls of Hughes Cave are a dull, muddy tan. And in the beam of a flashlight, every corner looks like the last one you passed. Underground, your brain starts to play tricks on you. Without the sun to tell you the time or the horizon to tell you where you are, your internal GPS starts to glitch. The group began to spread out. It wasn't a big deal at first, just a few feet of distance between people. But Hockett slowly drifted toward the back, then further, then into a side passage that looked like the right way. He wasn't running, he was just walking at his own pace, trusting that the others were just around the next bend. The problem is that caves are acoustic nightmares. The damp, porous limestone doesn't echo the way you think it would. Instead, it swallows sound. You can be 30 feet away from someone and not hear them scream. Hockett kept moving forward, deeper into the silence. He thought he heard the faint scrape of a boot or a distant voice, but it was just his mind filling in the blanks. By the time he realized he couldn't hear his friends anymore, the silence was absolute. The moment of realization in a cave is terrifying. It's not a loud, dramatic panic. It's a cold, sinking feeling in your gut. Hockett stopped. He stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs, and waited. He strained his ears, hoping for the sound of a whistle or a call. Nothing. The cave was silent, except for the sound of his own pulse thumping in his ears. He decided to do the logical thing, turn around and retrace his steps. But here is the secret about caves. They are one-way puzzles. A passage looks completely different when you're looking at it from the other side. The rock formations you used as landmarks on the way in are hidden by shadows on the way out. Hockett tried to find his way back, but every turn felt like a gamble. He was moving through a labyrinth of stone, and the more he moved, the deeper he got into the maze. Then, the nightmare got worse. His flashlight, his only lifeline, started to dim. In a cave, light is everything. It's the difference between being a human being and being a blind animal. He probably shook the light, hoping it was just a loose connection. But the beam kept fading, turning from a bright white to a sickly, weak yellow. Then, it flickered twice and died. People talk about pitch black, but you don't truly understand it until you're in a cave. It's not like being in your bedroom at night, where there's a sliver of light under the door or a glow from the streetlights. This is total sensory deprivation. Your eyes open as wide as they can go, searching for even a single photon, but there is nothing. It is a void so complete that your brain starts to hallucinate shapes and colors just to keep from going crazy. In this darkness, you lose your balance. You lose your sense of up and down. Hockett knew that if he tried to walk in this, he'd eventually step into a hole or smash his head against a low-hanging rock. He did the only thing he could. He sat down on the cold, wet floor and became part of the silence. While Hockett was sitting in the dark, the world above was moving on. The sun set over Alabama, and the woods around Hughes Cave grew dark. When the rest of the group finally scrambled out of the entrance, they started counting heads. The realization hit them like a physical blow. One person was missing. They called out his name into the mouth of the cave, but only the cold wind answered. They didn't waste time. They knew that every minute Hockett spent in the cave, his body temperature was dropping. They called 911, and the Morgan County Rescue Squad was dispatched. The rescue squad didn't rush in blindly. They knew that a simple rescue can turn into a double tragedy if you aren't careful. They gathered at the entrance, checking their gear. They carried backup lights, extra batteries, blankets, and water. They moved into the cave like a military unit, systematic and slow. They weren't just looking for Hockett. They were looking for any sign of where he might have gone, a footprint in the mud or a scuff mark on a rock. They shouted his name, their voices booming through the tunnels, but the cave seemed to push the sound back at them. They pushed deeper into the wild sections of the cave, checking every crawl space and every side chamber. Hours had passed by the time a rescuer's light finally hit something that wasn't limestone. They saw a figure huddled against the wall, perfectly still. For a second, they probably feared the worst. But as the lights got closer, Hockett moved. He was alive, uninjured, but completely stranded by the dark. He had been sitting there for hours, listening to the drip of water and the sound of his own breathing, wondering if he'd ever see the sun again. The rescue team didn't need to do anything fancy. They didn't need ropes or stretchers. They just gave him a fresh light, some water, and guided him back through the maze. When Hockett finally walked out of the cave and into the night air, the transition must have been overwhelming. After hours in a lightless tomb, even the dim glow of the moon feels like a spotlight. He was lucky. He had stayed put, which made him easy to find. He hadn't panicked and hurt himself. But the story of Hughes Cave is a chilling reminder of how fragile we are. We think we're in control because we have technology and maps, but all it takes is a set of dead batteries to turn a man into a prisoner. The Morgan County Rescue Squad later filed their report, calling it a routine mission, and, in a way, it was. But routine doesn't mean it wasn't dangerous. It just means they were prepared for the worst-case scenario. The lesson Hockett learned that night is one that every caver should know. The cave doesn't have to collapse to trap you. It just has to turn out the lights. In the world below, your life is only as certain as your spare batteries. If you go into the earth with only one light, you're not exploring. You're just waiting for the dark to find you. Memorial Day weekend, August 2005. A team of experienced surveyors prepared for an ambitious mapping expedition into a recently discovered cave system. The cave was significant. Extensive passages that required documentation, chambers that needed measuring, routes that demanded careful survey work to create accurate maps for future explorers. The team planned a lengthy underground trip, knowing they would spend many hours in the cave completing their survey objectives. The weather that weekend was unstable. Rain fell intermittently across the region, sometimes in brief showers, sometimes in more sustained downpours. But the surveyors had a job to do, maps to create, passages to document. They entered the cave at approximately 12:30 p.m., beginning their descent into Columbia Canyon, a large lower-level trunk passage that served as the highway to their survey area deep in the system. The trek to the far end of Columbia Canyon took 3 hours. This was serious cave travel, not a casual stroll through tourist-friendly passages. The surveyors moved through chambers and passages, descended vertical drops, navigated obstacles, and covered significant distance into the cave's interior. By the time they reached their survey area, they were deep underground, far from the entrance, committed to hours of work before beginning the long return journey. The team split into two groups to maximize efficiency. Cave surveying is methodical work, measuring distances with tape, recording compass bearings, noting passage dimensions, documenting features. Each survey station must be precisely located and recorded. The work proceeds slowly, but creates the detailed maps that allow future explorers to understand the cave's three-dimensional structure. At one point, one survey team worked through a large room with a distinctive feature. The floor was covered with mud hills rising 20 to 30 feet, 6 to 9 meters high. These mud formations created a surreal landscape, transformed the room into something resembling Badlands, or desert terrain transplanted underground. The team noted that the mud was very slick, apparently from recent flooding. Water had been through this room not long ago, saturating the mud, making the surfaces treacherous. As they completed their survey of the mud hill room, the team discovered something concerning. One of their earlier survey points, located close to a pool of water, was now underwater. The water level had risen since they had placed that survey station. Water was entering the cave system and accumulating. The surveyors continued their work until approximately 1:30 a.m., 13 hours after entering the cave. They had accomplished their survey objectives, documented new passages, extended the known map of the cave system. Now it was time to exit. They packed their equipment, organized their survey notes, and began the long trek back toward the entrance. The return journey followed the same route they had used coming in, retracing their path through Columbia Canyon toward the entrance. As they approached the bottom of a vertical section called the Puppet Buster Drop, they encountered an unexpected obstacle that stopped them completely. Water had filled the passage at the base of the Puppet Buster. Where there had been dry or damp passage on their way in, there was now a pool approximately 100 feet, 30 meters long, and 15 to 20 feet, 4.6 to 6 meters, deep. The passage was completely flooded. There was no way around the water. The pool filled the passage from wall to wall. There was no alternative route up the pit. The Puppet Buster was the only way out of this section of the cave. The surveyors assessed their situation. They were weighted down with vertical gear, ropes, harnesses, ascending devices, helmets with mounted lights, battery packs. They carried survey equipment, personal gear, water bottles, everything needed for a 13-hour underground expedition. Swimming 100 feet while burdened with all this equipment was not just difficult, it was potentially fatal. The weight could drag them under, the equipment could entangle, exhaustion could set in before reaching the far side. Pete Pencer decided to attempt the crossing. He emptied his pack of everything except essentials, reducing weight as much as possible while still maintaining critical equipment. He entered the water and began swimming toward the rope hanging at the far end of the pool, marking the base of the Puppet Buster climb. He made it approximately 10 feet, 3 meters, before the reality of the situation became clear. The weight of his remaining gear, the drag of his clothing, the physical exertion of swimming in cave water, all of it combined to make forward progress nearly impossible. He struggled to stay afloat, fighting to keep his head above water, burning energy at an unsustainable rate. He turned back before exhaustion or submersion made return impossible. The team brainstormed solutions. They needed flotation, something to help support Pencer's weight in the water, and allow him to cross the 100-foot pool without drowning. In a moment of creative problem solving, they hit upon an idea. They emptied Pencer's pack completely and filled it with empty water bottles, plastic containers that had held their drinking water during the survey work. The air-filled bottles created a makeshift flotation device. Pencer entered the water again, this time with his pack full of empty water bottles providing buoyancy. The improvised flotation device worked. He was able to swim and float across the pool, making steady progress toward the far side. The 100-foot crossing that had seemed impossible with his weighted gear became manageable with the aid of the water bottle flotation. He reached the rope at the far end of the pool, grabbed it, and pulled himself out of the water. His companions watched from the near side of the pool as Pencer began climbing the puppet buster. He was heading out of the cave to get help. The remaining surveyors settled down to wait at the edge of the pool, knowing they would be stuck there for hours while Pencer made the long journey to the surface and organized a rescue party. Pencer climbed the puppet buster and continued toward the entrance, retracing the 3-hour route through Columbia Canyon alone. He reached the surface at approximately 9:45 a.m., nearly 21 hours after the team had originally entered the cave. He made his way to the field house where other surveyors were staying, a nearby location where the caving community gathered during expeditions to this area. Pencer reported the situation. A survey team was trapped at the bottom of the puppet buster by a flooded passage approximately 100 feet long and 15 to 20 feet deep. They needed flotation assistance to cross. They had been underground for 21 hours and would need food and dry clothing after spending hours sitting at the edge of a pool in the constant cool temperature of the cave environment. A rescue party was quickly assembled. Experienced cave rescuers gathered an air mattress for flotation, food to replenish the stranded surveyors' energy, and extra clothing since the trap team had likely become cold during their extended wait. Shortly after 11 a.m., the rescue group entered the cave carrying their supplies and equipment. The journey to the puppet buster took time. This was not a quick dash to a nearby location, but a deliberate movement through extensive cave passages to reach the stranded team deep in the system. After 6 hours spent waiting at the edge of the pool, the trap surveyors finally heard sounds echoing through the passages. Their friends were approaching. Rescue was arriving. A wetsuit-wearing member of the rescue team entered the flooded passage. The wetsuit provided thermal protection in the cold cave water and some buoyancy assistance. The rescuer swam across the pool, trailing a rope and carrying the air mattress. Once across, the rope was secured, creating a fixed line that stretched across the 100-foot flooded section. The stranded surveyors were pulled across the pool one by one, using the air mattress for flotation and the rope for guidance and support. Each person made the crossing that had seemed impossible hours earlier, now achievable with proper flotation and a secured rope. As each surveyor reached the far side, they climbed out of the water, cold and exhausted, but safe. Food and dry clothes were distributed. The surveyors changed out of their wet garments, ate to restore energy depleted by hours of waiting in the cold cave environment, and prepared for the final push to the surface. The entire group began making their way out through Columbia Canyon toward the entrance. The last members of the group reached the surface at approximately 7:15 p.m. They had been underground for 33 hours, from 12:30 p.m. the previous day through 7:15 p.m. the following evening. What had been planned as a lengthy but manageable survey trip had become an extended ordeal due to flooding that blocked their primary exit route. The post-incident analysis revealed the factors that had created the dangerous situation. It had been a rainy weekend with cloudbursts dropping as much as 2 inches, 5 centimeters of rain in an hour. Total rainfall in the area reached approximately 6 inches, 15 centimeters, a substantial amount of water that had to go somewhere. In karst terrain, surface water drains rapidly into limestone cave systems. The caves serve as natural storm drains, channeling rainwater underground through passages and shafts. The survey team had entered a recently discovered cave during a rainy weekend and had been trapped by flooding for 6 hours, requiring rescue assistance to extract them after 33 hours underground. They had survived only through a combination of skill, creativity, and the rapid response of experienced cave rescuers. April 1st, 2015. A woman approached the entrance to Dekra Ice Cave in Iowa, curious about the unusual geological feature that had drawn visitors for decades. Dekra Ice Cave held dangers beyond its frozen beauty. In the 1980s, unstable rocks in the ceiling had prompted the Iowa State Parks Department to take action. The cave extended deep into the hillside, but geological assessments revealed that portions of the ceiling were actively deteriorating. Rocks could fall without warning, crushing or killing anyone beneath them. The Parks Department installed a gate, restricting public access to only the first 50 feet, 15 meters of the cave, the entrance area where ice formations could still be viewed, but where the overhead instability was less severe. The gate allowed visitors to experience the cave's unique environment while preventing them from venturing into more dangerous sections. Warning signs explained the restrictions. The ice near the entrance remained accessible, creating a balance between public access and safety management. The woman entered the accessible section of Decorah Ice Cave, stepping carefully on the ice-covered floor. Ice caves present unique challenges for visitors. The ice isn't seasonal, it's permanent, maintained year-round by the cave's specific microclimate. It forms in layers, creating surfaces that range from rough and grippable to smooth and glassy. Areas that appear stable might conceal thinner ice over voids or depressions. The woman wore regular footwear, standard shoes or boots without specialized traction devices. For a brief visit to an accessible cave entrance, this seemed reasonable. She stepped forward on the ice, and her foot slipped. The smooth ice provided no friction, no grip for her boot sole. Her body weight shifted unexpectedly. She fell, her ankle twisting violently as her foot went out from under her. The pain was immediate and severe, the sharp, overwhelming sensation of bones and ligaments being forced beyond their normal range of motion. But the fall didn't stop there. The ice sloped downward into the cave. Her body, now on the ice surface and lacking any way to arrest the slide, began moving deeper into the cave. She slid past the 50-foot mark, where the gate restricted normal access, continuing down the icy slope into sections that were supposed to be off-limits. The ice carried her further from the entrance, further from help, deeper into Decorah Ice Cave. When she finally stopped sliding, she was well beyond the gated area, lying on ice in a section of cave that visitors weren't supposed to reach. Her ankle throbbed with pain that suggested serious injury. She attempted to stand, to walk, to make her way back up the icy slope toward the entrance. But her twisted ankle couldn't bear weight. The pain was too severe, the injury too significant. She was stuck. The ice that had caused her fall now became a prison. She couldn't climb back up the slick slope with an injured ankle. She couldn't call for help. Cell phones don't work underground. She couldn't do anything except wait and hope that someone would notice her absence and organize a rescue. Someone did notice. The woman's companions or other visitors realized she was missing. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Local police responded first, arriving at Decorah Ice Cave and assessing the situation. Fire department personnel were dispatched, bringing equipment and expertise for technical rescue operations. Rescue squad members assembled, preparing for the possibility of complex extraction from a confined space with overhead hazards. Ambulance crews staged nearby, ready to provide medical care once the victim was brought to the surface. The rescue team entered Decorah Ice Cave equipped with proper traction devices, crampons or slip-on spikes that allowed them to navigate the ice safely. They carried rope systems for lowering and raising, medical supplies for initial treatment, and a litter for transporting the injured woman if she couldn't walk even with assistance. They found her lying on the ice beyond the gated area, conscious but in significant pain. The rescue team stabilized her ankle as best they could in the cave environment. Rope systems were rigged, creating mechanical advantage for raising the woman up the ice slope. Some rescuers positioned themselves above to manage the rope system. Others stayed with the victim, ensuring she didn't contact sharp ice formations or overhead obstructions during the ascent. The extraction proceeded slowly and carefully, prioritizing safety over speed. The woman was raised up the ice slope foot by foot, the rope system providing controlled movement that prevented sliding back down. The rescuers navigated past the gate that should have prevented her from entering this section in the first place, bringing her back into the accessible first 50 feet of the cave. From there, the extraction became easier. The slope was less severe, the footing more manageable, the distance to the entrance shorter. She emerged from Decora Ice Cave into daylight, surrounded by the rescue personnel who had worked to extract her safely. Ambulance crews immediately took over medical care, conducting a more thorough assessment of her injured ankle and checking for other injuries from the fall and slide. The woman was loaded into the ambulance and transported to a hospital where orthopedic specialists could properly diagnose and treat her injury. The rescue had succeeded. She was out of the cave, receiving appropriate medical care, on her way to recovery, rather than still trapped on the ice with an injury that could have led to hypothermia or other complications if rescue had been delayed. Decora Ice Cave remained open to visitors after the incident, the gate still restricting access to the first 50 feet, the ice still forming its year-round frozen environment. Warning signs continued to explain restrictions and hazards, but the cave made no allowance for inadequate footwear or momentary slips. The ice remained as treacherous as ever, waiting for the next visitor who underestimated the need for proper traction devices in an environment where friction disappears and a single slip can send you sliding into restricted areas with a twisted ankle and the need for coordinated rescue to extract you from permanent winter in an Iowa hillside. July 23, 2023. Ajanta Caves, a place built to outlive kingdoms. And a man came all this way to stand beside a gorge during monsoon season, not to study the murals, not to feel history, not even to watch the waterfall. He came to do the modern pilgrimage. Walk to the edge of something ancient and dangerous, turn your back to it, and ask a phone camera to make you look immortal. It's the kind of decision that takes a situation from beautiful day trip to instant Darwin Award audition in one thumb tap, because the only thing more slippery than those wet basalt rocks is the logic that says a selfie is worth leaning for. In the Ajanta Hills, the monsoon doesn't arrive like weather. It arrives like a verdict, gray sky pressing down, water running in thin sheets over stone that was carved long before anyone thought of cameras, phones, or the strange human urge to prove you were somewhere by freezing yourself in front of it. Ajanta Caves sit like a row of quiet mouths cut into basalt, ancient and patient. Their interiors painted with stories that survived empires. People come for the art, the history, the silence that feels older than language. But outside, where the path bends toward the viewpoints and the falls, the silence breaks into the constant noise of tourism. Footsteps, laughter, plastic water bottles, the click-click of screens, and the wind pushing mist off the waterfall as if trying to erase the crowd. Somewhere near the Saptkund waterfall viewpoint, a man named Gopal Pundlik Chavan, 30 years old, was there with friends. He had traveled from Nandi to visit the famous site in Maharashtra. Nothing about him was supposed to become a headline. He wasn't an explorer, not a mountaineer, not a rescuer, not a man on a mission. He was a visitor, like thousands before him, another body moving through a place that has watched bodies move through it for nearly 2,000 years. And like so many visitors now, he reached the edge of something immense and immediately turned his back to it. That's the ritual. Stand near the drop, frame your face with the scenery behind you, make the world look harmless and orderly inside a rectangle. The waterfall becomes a backdrop. The gorge becomes an aesthetic. The danger becomes invisible until it is not. The rocks near waterfalls are never truly rock. They are a thin negotiation between friction and gravity, constantly rewritten by water. Monsoon rain polishes stone into a slick, dark sheen. Moss and algae bloom in the places your shoe insists are safe. A step that would be stable in winter becomes a trap in July. You can feel it underfoot if you pay attention. the faint betrayal in the surface, like the ground has already decided not to hold you and is waiting for your weight to make it official. But he was determined to conquer it. He wasn't there for some noble purpose that might at least make the risk make sense. He was there because a waterfall behind your head looks impressive. He wasn't testing nature, he was testing a camera angle. While doing so, disaster struck. He slipped and went down. It wasn't something that came with a warning. That's what people misunderstand about accidents, how quiet they can be. 1 second you're leaning, micro-adjusting your stance, shifting weight onto the wrong foot by a few centimeters. The next second, there is no ground in the way your brain expects. There is only movement, a blur of stone, water noise turning suddenly enormous. The instant of weightlessness where your stomach rises and your hands claw at air as if air could be grabbed and held. Then the world drops out from under you. He went down into a gorge estimated around 70 feet deep. Not a mythic abyss, not a cinematic plunge, just a very real fall with very real rock waiting at the bottom. You don't need a bigger number. 70 feet is more than enough to erase a person. It's enough to break a spine, enough to split a skull, enough to turn a nice day trip into an empty seat on the ride home. What matters is this: he didn't land the way gravity usually insists you land. Somehow, through luck, instinct, the angle of the slope, the way the water had carved the gorge, he ended up clinging to stone near the waterfall. Not comfortably, not safely. Just not dead yet. This is the part that feels cryptic when you imagine it from his perspective, because above him is the world he came from. The viewpoint, the railing, his friends, the sound of normal life continuing. People pointing, people filming, people shouting into phones. A crowd that can see you but cannot reach you. And below him is the other world. The gorge's wet throat, the river, and the plunge pool. The places where the rock is black with constant spray. The places your hands slip even when you're trying not to. There are two kinds of falls. The ones where you hit bottom and the story ends, and the ones where you don't hit bottom, where you are suspended in the middle of disaster, forced to understand that survival is not an event, but a long, exhausting process. Clinging to that stone, he had to solve a brutal equation: hold on long enough for help to arrive, and don't make a single mistake while you wait. Because in that position, time becomes an enemy with teeth. Your fingers begin to burn. Your forearms cramp until they feel like cables being twisted tighter and tighter. Your shoes, wet, slick, search for friction that isn't there. The waterfall's mist turns your skin cold, and cold makes your muscles less reliable. Your breath comes too fast, and the faster it comes, the weaker your grip feels, and the weaker your chances of survival. His friends did the only useful thing they could do. They alerted authorities immediately, and the authorities did what rescue always does. It arrived with ropes and urgency, and the grim understanding that the difference between rescued and recovered is often measured in minutes. A police team rushed to the spot, getting a rope into play, because in places like this, the first person to respond is rarely a superhero. It's whoever is closest and brave enough to move. The rescue itself became the kind of thing that goes viral: a rope, many hands, the tense geometry of pulling a living person up from a place that wants to keep them. You can watch those videos later and feel only adrenaline, but if you slow the scene down in your head, you see the real terror. The rope goes tight, the body shifts, the wet rock offers no kindness, and the smallest mistake, one slip during the lift, could turn rescue into tragedy in a blink. The cruelest detail isn't that he fell, it's why he fell. And the place itself makes that trade feel even darker. Ajanta is an ancient art built into living rock. The caves were carved by hands that expected time to be long and life to be fragile. The paintings inside speak in colors that survived by accident and miracle. Even the silence in those chambers feels like a warning. You are temporary. But outside, at the viewpoint, people behave like the opposite is true. The rescue went on for a long time. When the rope finally caught him, The people above began to lift. The grim reality started setting in. The physics now had changed. He was no longer only fighting gravity. He was now fighting the chaos of being moved while wet, shocked, exhausted. Each jolt threatening to peel him off whatever rock was holding him. The water kept roaring, indifferent. The crowd kept staring. His friends, somewhere at the top, had the sick feeling of knowing they brought him here and almost watched him die for something that wasn't worth the walk. And then, somewhere in the sequence of pulling and bracing and hauling, he crossed back into the safe world. A hard line, invisible but absolute. On one side, the gorge, on the other, the path. Reports describe him as rescued by police after the incident. Some coverage noted the operation lasted around an hour, a short time on a clock, an eternity when you're hanging on. That's the part most people think is the end, the rope, the pull, the miracle. But there's another ending that's quieter and meaner, because when you survive something like this, you don't just survive the fall, you survive the replay. That is the cryptic curse of places like Ajanta in the age of phones. The land is ancient, the danger is real, and the decision that triggers it can be as small as a thumb tapping a screen. A story that could have been a tragedy became because he lived. A brutal little parable about modern risk. How people will stand beside ancient death and smile for a camera as if the world is obligated to hold them. But the next person who leans toward that gorge for just one more shot should understand something before their foot finds the slick part of the rock. The cliff does not know what a selfie is. It only knows weight. It only knows friction. It only knows the difference between standing and falling. And it does not care how good the background looks. It will only look into creating another instant Darwin Award audition. December 27th, 2007. Stuart Goodwill, 33 years old, prepared for a potholing expedition that introduced his colleague Caroline Fletcher to the underground world he loved. Caroline, 28, from Keighley in West Yorkshire, had asked Stuart multiple times to take her caving. She was eager to experience what drew him underground so frequently, curious about the sport that occupied so much of his passion and time. Stuart was an experienced potholer, someone who understood the Yorkshire Dales cave systems, someone who knew the risks and how to manage them. For Caroline's first trip, he chose Alum Pot near Horton and Ribblesdale in North Yorkshire, one of Britain's most popular cave systems, frequently used by school parties and colleges as an introductory cave. Stuart and Caroline both worked in the water treatment industry. Their jobs involved understanding water systems, flow rates, and treatment processes, the technical aspects of managing water in controlled environments. They set off on Thursday morning, December 27th, entering the Alum Pot system with all the correct equipment. Stuart ensured Caroline was properly outfitted, helmet, lights, appropriate clothing, ropes, and harnesses. This was a proper potholing expedition, with an experienced leader taking responsibility for a novice's safety. The Alum Pot system is extensive, with various routes and chambers connected by passages and vertical drops. One of the routes leads through Long Lower Churn, a streamway where water flows through the cave. A stream runs through this section constantly. Not a large river, just the steady flow of water that has carved these passages over millennia. Under normal conditions, the stream is manageable, something cavers wade through or cross without significant concern. But conditions above ground were not normal. The fells surrounding the cave system had experienced heavy downpours. Rain had saturated the ground, filling every depression, running off hillsides, seeking the path of least resistance downward. In the Yorkshire Dales, that path leads underground. The porous limestone is riddled with fissures, sinks, and cave systems that drain surface water into subterranean passages. When heavy rain falls on already saturated ground, water runs directly into the caves, transforming gentle streams into torrents within minutes. Stuart and Caroline were in Long Lower Churn when the water began to rise. Flash floods in cave systems don't develop gradually. They explode. Water that was ankle-deep becomes knee-deep, then waist-deep, then chest-deep in the span of minutes. The gentle stream becomes a churning torrent. The passage that was comfortably navigable becomes an underwater tube with current strong enough to knock people off their feet. At some point during the rising water, one of them lost their footing. The mechanics are straightforward. Potholers often rope together for safety, particularly when an experienced person is guiding a novice. If one person slips in current, their weight and the rope connection can pull the other person down. This was Caroline's first potholing trip. She had no experience with cave systems, no training in managing emergencies underground, no practiced calm that comes from handling difficult situations in caves. Cave streams in December in Yorkshire are brutally cold, typically around 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 to 7 degrees Celsius. Immersion in water that cold rapidly saps body heat. Within minutes, hypothermia begins. Within 30 minutes, cognitive function deteriorates. Stuart faced a decision. Caroline was cold. As an experienced potholer, Stuart understood their options. They could try to exit the cave, fighting through the rising water and strong current, attempting to reach safety before conditions worsened further. Or they could find a position above the stream level, hunker down, and wait for the flood to pass. Cave floods, even flash floods, are temporary. The water rises rapidly, but also recedes relatively quickly once the surface water drains through. Sitting out the flood, finding a ledge or chamber above the water level and waiting is often the correct survival strategy. Stuart made the decision to try to exit together. They attempted to leave the cave, moving through the flooded passages, trying to reach the entrance in safety. The water continued rising, the current strengthened. The passages that had been straightforward to traverse on the way in became dangerous obstacles on the way out. But then, disaster struck at the worst possible time. At some point during their attempted exit, they became entangled in the ropes they were using for safety. The same ropes meant to protect them became traps. The ropes held them in place as the water continued to rise. They couldn't free themselves from the entanglement. They couldn't reach the air. The water level rose above their heads. Stuart's wife, Claire, raised the alarm when her husband failed to return home. She knew where he had gone. Stuart had provided clear details about the planned route, the cave system, the expected return time. When he didn't come home, she immediately contacted North Yorkshire Police at 1 a.m. Stuart had done everything correctly in terms of preparation and communication. The cave rescue organization based at nearby Clapham responded to the call. 20 rescuers assembled and entered the alum pot system, searching through the night. Phil Hay, the CRO's duty officer, led the team down into the cave. They knew where to look based on the information Claire had provided. They navigated to Long Lower Churn and quickly located them. The sight was grim. The two had drowned in Long Lower Churn, held in place by the safety equipment that should have protected them. The recovery team faced the difficult task of extricating the bodies from the ropes and bringing them out of the cave system. Cave body recoveries are physically and emotionally demanding. The rescuers are often cave explorers themselves, people who understand the risks, who have been in similar caves under similar conditions. The team worked methodically in the confined space. Each rope had to be cut or untied in a specific sequence to free the bodies without causing them to shift suddenly or become more entangled. The cold water, the tight passage dimensions, and the emotional weight of recovering the two, people like themselves who had simply been caught by conditions beyond their control, made the work physically and mentally exhausting. Once freed from the ropes, the bodies were carefully secured in recovery equipment. Moving them back through Long Lower Churn required coordination between multiple team members, some ahead clearing the route, some behind managing the bodies, all working to navigate the passage that had killed Stuart and Caroline just hours earlier. The recovery team then hauled both bodies through the cave system, back through the passages and chambers until finally bringing them out of Alampat's entrance. The entire recovery operation took several hours. By the time Stuart and Caroline were brought to the surface, dawn was breaking on December 28th. Their bodies were handed over to the authorities, and the grim work of notifying families and beginning the official investigation could proceed. The timing made it particularly dreadful. Just a few days after Christmas, still within the holiday season, Stuart's wife Claire was dealing with the reality that her husband of 3 years was dead. Caroline's family was processing the loss of a young woman who had been excited to try potholing for the first time. The inquest at Skipton Coroner's Court examined the circumstances of the deaths. Cave rescuer David Gallivan provided expert testimony about the decisions Stuart and Caroline had made. His assessment was stark. The decision to try and leave the cave was a mistake. They may have survived if they had sat the flood out, found a position above the water level, and waited for the flood to recede, rather than attempting to exit through rising water. Claire Goodwill described her husband as brilliant and noted, "He did everything correctly." Caroline was a colleague, and she had asked him a few times to take her potholing. It was something he loved. Stuart had been sharing his passion with a friend, introducing her to the underground world that fascinated him, doing it responsibly with proper equipment and planning. He died trying to save her when conditions turned deadly. Alampat remained one of Britain's most popular cave systems after the tragedy. School parties and colleges continued using it as an introductory cave. The long lower churn streamway continued flowing, sometimes gently, sometimes as a torrent when surface conditions sent water underground. The cave made no distinction between experienced potholers and excited novices. If you've ever hiked in deep winter snow, you know how the world changes when everything turns white. Familiar trails disappear, sound gets muffled, landmarks blur together, and the ground, the thing you trust without thinking, can suddenly become the most dangerous part of the entire trip. Because snow doesn't just cover the trail, sometimes it covers nothing. And on Mount Hood in Oregon in late November of 1982, one man found that out in the most brutal way possible. This is the story of Larry Ritchie, a 34-year-old hiker who went out for what was supposed to be a 3-day winter trek and ended up into a terrifying nightmare. Larry wasn't reckless. He wasn't out there in sneakers and a hoodie like he was going to the mall. On Friday, November 25th, Larry started a projected 3-day hike through the winter wilderness on the north slopes of Mount Hood, part of Oregon's Cascade Mountains. He dressed the way you're supposed to dress: long underwear, wool pants, and wool shirt, a parka, mittens, rubber-soled boots. He also packed food and shelter, the basics you'd want in cold backcountry conditions. And maybe the smartest thing he did before leaving was this: he left an itinerary with friends. He told them where he'd be going, and he planned to be back by Tuesday the 29th. That one decision would end up mattering a lot later, because by the second half of his trip, Mount Hood decided it was done being calm. On Sunday, the weather shifted and snow started coming down. Larry moved slowly on snowshoes, working his way across terrain that had probably looked manageable the day before, but now was becoming a blank, featureless surface. And as he shuffled forward, step by step, he probably did what every hiker does in snow. He trusted that the snow in front of him was the same as the snow behind him, until it wasn't. At some point, Larry took a step, and the ground simply disappeared. He plunged into a snow-covered hole, a hidden pit masked perfectly by fresh snowfall, and fell about 12 to 14 feet, landing hard on his back. Now, falling into a hole like that can snap bones, crush your spine, or knock you unconscious. And if that happens in winter wilderness, it often becomes a death sentence. But Larry had one thing going for him: his pack. When he hit the bottom, the pack absorbed enough impact that it likely prevented major injury. He was shaken up, bruised, in pain, but alive and alert. Then he looked around. And that's when he realized this wasn't just a shallow depression. He was at the bottom of a pit about 10 feet in diameter, with overhung walls, meaning the walls didn't slope nicely upward like a bowl. They curved inward. They were shaped in a way that made climbing out almost impossible. And to make the whole scene feel even more unreal, there was a stream of water swirling along the floor of the pit. So picture this. You've just fallen into a hidden hole in the snow. You're in a round pit with walls that lean over you like a lid. And at your feet, the ice-cold water is moving constantly, like the pit itself is alive. Larry did the first thing you'd do if you were trapped underground and daylight was gone. He pulled out a candle and lit it. The flame brought a little light, but it also confirmed something terrifying. There was no easy route out. Still, Larry didn't panic. Not yet. He noticed the stream seemed to come from somewhere, a passage opening. So he tried the only option other than staring at the walls. He explored the passage. For about 200 feet, he moved through the tunnel, following the water, hoping it would lead to an opening or a larger chamber or some kind of escape route. But he found no exit, and worse, there was no air movement. That last detail matters. If you're in a confined underground space and the air is stale, you start thinking about oxygen, about carbon dioxide building up, about whether the place you've landed in is even safe to stay inside for long. Larry didn't like what he was feeling, so he turned around and returned to the pit. Now he had to face the fact that his only way back to the surface was the same hole he'd fallen through. And the hole was above him, ringed with boulders and snow, and the walls beneath it were overhung and slick. Climbing wasn't happening, so Larry shifted into survival mode. He ate some food, but there was a problem. His stove had been smashed in the fall. That meant no hot meals, no hot drinks, and in a freezing environment, heat is currency. He would eat everything cold. Then he pulled out a piece of gear he had brought that, at the time, probably felt like an afterthought. A 30-foot rope. 30 feet isn't a lot in mountaineering terms, but down in that pit, it might as well have been a lifeline. Larry got an idea. If he could tie something heavy to one end of the rope, like a rock, he might be able to throw it up through the hole like a makeshift grappling hook, snag it on something outside, and then climb out. It's the kind of idea you come up with when you've run out of normal options. So he tied a rock to the rope, then he threw and threw again and again. But every time, the rock came back down, clacking off stone, dropping back into the pit like the mountain was batting it away. Larry kept trying. For 3 days, he tried, and during those 3 days, the pit turned into its own form of torture. The water never stopped moving. It swirled along the bottom, so he couldn't just lie down and rest, not without soaking himself, and in cold conditions, wet clothing is a direct path to hypothermia. The first 2 nights, Larry slept standing up. Let that sink in, standing in a dark pit, with his feet in the water. That's not sleep, not really. It's more like shutting your eyes in short bursts and hoping you don't collapse. By the 3rd night, his body was breaking down. So he did something desperate and ingenious. He made a loop in the rope and managed to hang himself in it, suspended from a tree root, not hanging like a noose, hanging like a climber in a harness, taking his weight off his legs so he could keep his feet out of the water and conserve warmth. Imagine how quiet it must have been. The faint sound of moving water, the occasional drip, the candlelight flickering, and this guy half sleeping while dangling in a loop of rope because it's the only way to keep from freezing. While Larry fought this battle underground, above him, the world kept moving. His friends expected him back by Tuesday. Tuesday came, and Larry didn't show. That evening, his absence was reported to the Hood River Sheriff's Office. On Wednesday, searchers went out on snowmobiles and tried to trace his intended route. But there was a cruel problem. New snow had covered his tracks. So even though they had a plan, even though they had an itinerary, the trail itself had been erased. They tried helicopters, but fog and bad weather made them ineffective. And Larry, in that pit, had no idea how close help might be. or how far. He was on his own. By Thursday, Larry had consumed all his food. No stove, no hot drinks, no calories coming in. And now the hypothermia started creeping in. Not like a dramatic instant collapse, but like a slow sabotage. His speech began to slur. His limbs started losing coordination. The kind of unsteadiness that makes simple tasks harder and harder until you can't tell if you're clumsy or dying. And this is the moment when a lot of survival stories end. Because when hypothermia gets deep enough, your mind turns against you. But Larry still had one thing working perfectly: his stubbornness. So he threw the rope again. And this time, the rock snagged. It caught the limb of a dead tree outside the hole. After days of failure, suddenly the rope held tension. Larry didn't hesitate. He hauled on it, tested it, and then started climbing, dragging himself up, fighting gravity, wet boots scraping for purchase on stone and packed snow. And then, finally, he pulled himself free of the pit. He was out. But he wasn't safe, because now he was out in the open again, soaked, exhausted, hypothermic, and running on fumes. And it was raining. The worst thing he could do at that point was stop moving. If he stopped, he'd cool down fast and he might never start again. So he walked. He slogged through the wet cold for 10 miles until he reached Highway 35. 10 miles might not sound like much when you're rested and dry, but after days in a pit, standing in freezing water, eating cold food, and slipping into hypothermia, 10 miles is a marathon. Larry made it to the highway, got a ride, and finally reached safety. And just like that, a story that was on track to become a recovery operation turned into a survival miracle. If there's a lesson here, it's not the obvious "don't hike alone," because people hike solo all the time and come back fine. It's this: preparation buys you chances. Larry had warm clothes, he had candles, he had food, he had an itinerary left with friends, he had rope. And even though it didn't work for days, it worked once, and once was enough. And then there's the other factor that you can't pack in a backpack: attitude. Some people dropped into the same pit, in the same cold, would have burned through energy panicking, stopped trying, and lost the fight before rescue even had a chance. Larry kept trying. He kept throwing the rope. And on the day his body was starting to shut down, luck finally met persistence. A rock caught a dead limb, and he got out. A stone's throw from life, in the most literal way possible. On November 21st, 1982, 5 members of a local caving group entered Huckacove Cave to remove trash that had accumulated inside. It wasn't a thrill-seeking expedition. No pushing new routes, no risky exploration. Just gloves, trash bags, and a plan to leave the cave better than they found it. By early afternoon, the group was heading out. To exit Huckacove, you have to ascend a feature called Angel Falls, a steep, awkward climb involving narrow slots, overhangs, and ledges made not of solid rock, but of compacted mud that's hardened over time. And hardened is a relative term. Angel Falls had been climbed countless times. People had stood on the same ledges, used the same holds, passed gear the same way. Which is exactly why what happened next caught everyone completely off guard. The group formed a human chain to pass the trash bags up. 4 of them positioned themselves one above the other inside the slot. The idea was simple. Instead of hauling heavy, awkward bags individually, they'd pass them upward hand to hand. The 5th member stood slightly off to the side, on a protruding rock shelf, looking down at the others and coordinating the movement, taking the trash bags and moving them from above. For a moment, it worked perfectly. Trash bags went up. Hands reached down. Mud crumbled slightly, as it always did, but nothing alarming. The 5th member moved back and forth from the protruding rock ledge, and then suddenly, while standing and waiting for the next trash bag, the ground shifted as he moved, Just a subtle repositioning of his boots on what looked like solid ground, and that was enough. A section of the upper overhang, made almost entirely of dried mud, suddenly broke loose at its base. It wasn't a slow sag. It didn't crack or warn them. It simply let go. A chunk roughly 2 feet in diameter sheared off and dropped straight down. As it fell, it smashed into a second overhang, shattering into a violent spray of mud slabs and debris, and all of it came down onto the 4 men stacked beneath. The collapse didn't just hit them, it filled the slot. Mud exploded into every open space, shoulders, helmets, backs, arms, packing the narrow ascent like wet concrete. In seconds, all 4 were trapped beneath the collapse. For a split second, nobody moved. Then the screaming started, not panicked screaming, shocked screaming. Because they were buried, but they were conscious. The 5th member, still standing free on his ledge, stared down in disbelief. The space where 4 of his teammates had been standing was now a choking mass of broken mud and debris. He shouted. They shouted back. That alone told him something crucial. They were alive. He scrambled down as far as he safely could and began digging with his hands. So did the trapped ones. And that's when the situation turned worse, because Horrifying Cave doesn't forgive desperate movement. As they clawed at the mud, breaking chunks loose, gravity took over. Everything they dislodged had nowhere to go except down. And at the bottom of the stack was the lowest member, the one whose feet had already been standing in a shallow pocket of water at the base of the slot. Mud poured down around him. It filled gaps. It packed tighter. It sloughed off the walls, until suddenly his legs disappeared, then his waist, then his chest. The mud surged up and submerged him almost to his face. He couldn't move his arms freely anymore. He couldn't step back. He couldn't lie down. He was being buried upright. And if the mud reached his mouth or nose, it would be over in seconds. The terrifying part? He wasn't injured. No broken bones, no crushed limbs. Just trapped, immobilized by weight and pressure. The others realized what was happening and immediately changed tactics. They stopped pulling downward. Instead, they worked carefully from the sides, carving small channels, relieving pressure, making space inch by inch. The 5th member, still free, moved dirt upward and away, clearing a path toward the top. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the 4 trapped began to free themselves, one at a time. The topmost wriggled loose first, shaking mud from his helmet and shoulders, then the second, then the third. Each extraction made the pile slightly more stable. Finally, the bottom one was freed enough to move his legs and step back into a safer pocket. Amazingly, he was unhurt, covered in mud, shaking, but alive. For a moment, it seemed like the worst was over. The group regrouped, breathing hard, checking each other for injuries. Mud coated everything, helmets, ropes, packs, and the slot looked nothing like it had minutes earlier. They knew they needed to get out. Carefully, no more stacking, no more unnecessary movement. 1 person at a time. They ascended, chimneying out one by one. They reorganized the exit. The one who had been last in the stack, the one who had taken the brunt of the initial collapse, positioned himself to climb out next. He tested holds. He moved slowly. He kept his weight centered. For a few seconds, everything held. Then the cave reminded them that it wasn't finished. Without warning, another section of overhang collapsed. This time, it wasn't above all of them. It was directly over him. Mud and debris slammed down and buried him from the neck down. His head snapped forward as the weight hit his shoulders. His arms were pinned. His legs disappeared. His torso was locked in place. Only his helmeted head remained free. And this time, he was hurt. He cried out in pain, sharp, panicked, unmistakable. The collapse had driven mud into his back and chest, compressing him into the slot. Every breath became shallow and forced. He couldn't shift his weight. He couldn't brace. He couldn't help. He was stuck. The others froze, because this was the nightmare scenario. Dig too fast, and you risk triggering yet another collapse, one that could bury his head. Dig too slow, and he could suffocate, panic, or go into shock. They had to get him out, but they had to do it perfectly. The group made a decision that likely saved his life. Only one person would work on the rescue at a time. Everyone else backed off, minimizing vibration and movement. The rescuer positioned himself carefully and began removing mud by hand. Small amounts, deliberately chosen, testing stability after each scoop. No yanking, no pulling, no collapsing the sides. Just controlled excavation. The trapped man's breathing was shallow and rapid. Fear was setting in. Pain radiated through his back and shoulders. They talked to him constantly, kept him focused, kept him still. Minutes stretched, mud fell in clumps. Some held, some threatened to give way. Whenever the rescuer felt resistance or shifting, he stopped, waited, adjusted, then continued. Slowly, the pressure around his chest eased. Then his arms could move slightly, then one leg, then the other. Finally, with careful coordination, they freed him completely. He slumped forward, shaking, gasping, but alive. They didn't celebrate. They didn't relax. They still had to get out. Now they changed the plan entirely. No climbing unprotected, no passing bags, no standing on overhangs. They rigged a rope. One person ascended at a time. The rest stayed clear. Each movement was deliberate, tested, and retested. When the injured member's turn came, they took extra care, supporting his weight, guiding his movements, making sure nothing shifted unexpectedly. And finally, after what must have felt like hours compressed into minutes, the last of them cleared Angel Falls. They exited the cave battered, exhausted, covered in mud, but alive. The injuries, considering what had happened, were minor. Bruises, soreness, shock. One of them had taken a hit to the head, saved only by his hard hat. Another had been buried twice. All of them walked out. Later, analysis pointed to something deceptively simple. The overhangs were composed almost entirely of dried mud, not solid rock. Dry conditions over time had weakened the structure. What had once been firm had become brittle, holding just long enough to feel safe. Many cave explorers had used that same overhang before, which is the most dangerous part. Because familiarity breeds trust, and caves don't care how familiar you are. This wasn't recklessness, it wasn't stupidity. It wasn't even bad technique. It was a reminder that underground, nothing is permanent. A ledge can fail, a wall can move, a ceiling can fall, and sometimes the only difference between a close call and a fatality is the order in which people are standing, and whether someone above shifts their weight at the wrong moment. 5 spelunkers went into Huckacove Cave to clean up trash. 4 of them were buried alive in seconds. 1 of them was buried again while trying to escape, and all of them survived, not because the cave was merciful, but because they slowed down when panic would have been easier, and because they understood that underground, patience can be the difference between rescue and burial. On July 22, 2003, 28-year-old marine biologist Kirsty Brown was working near the Rothera Research Station on Adelaide Island, a British outpost surrounded by ice-choked seas, jagged coastlines, and complete isolation. The station operates at the edge of human endurance, where weather can shift without warning, and the surrounding landscape offers no forgiveness. During much of the year, especially the Austral winter, evacuation is impossible. If something goes wrong, the people stationed there must rely entirely on their own preparation, equipment, and teamwork. That afternoon, Kirsty and a fellow researcher entered the water around 3:10 p.m., wearing dry suits designed to protect them from the brutal cold of the Antarctic Ocean. The air temperature hovered around -8 degrees Celsius, and the water below was even colder, capable of rapidly draining body heat despite protective gear. They were snorkeling rather than scuba diving, which meant they carried no air tanks and relied entirely on breath holding and surface swimming, a method commonly used for shallow, near-shore research work in the area. Their task was straightforward: complete the final placement of seabed markers used to study how iceberg movement disturbed marine ecosystems. Over the course of the project, hundreds of concrete and plastic markers had been carefully positioned along the ocean floor to record patterns of damage caused by drifting ice. Kirsty and her team had nearly completed the first phase of the study, and this final session was expected to be brief and uneventful, the kind of work that felt routine after weeks of repetition. Before entering the water, the team followed established safety protocols. The surrounding sea was thoroughly checked, and visibility was exceptionally clear, extending nearly 30 meters beneath the surface. No predators were seen in the area. A shore party of 2 British Antarctic Survey personnel remained on land, watching the water continuously, ready to call for assistance if anything appeared out of the ordinary. One rule governed all Antarctic diving operations. If a leopard seal was spotted, the dive was immediately canceled. The policy existed for a reason. Leopard seals are apex predators, powerful, intelligent, and unpredictable. For more than 30 years, that single rule had ensured the safety of every diver operating out of Rothera Research Station. Then, without warning, that rule failed. As Kirsty swam near the surface, her partner gradually drifted about 15 to 20 meters away, moving at a slightly different pace while scanning the seabed below. Suddenly, he noticed something beneath her, something large. A dark, elongated shape moved silently through the water just below the surface, its outline barely visible against the icy blue background. It circled Kirsty slowly, deliberately, showing no sign of panic or aggression. At first, Kirsty did not react. The animal's movements appeared curious rather than hostile, and in an environment filled with marine life, brief encounters were not unusual. But the calm lasted only seconds. Then it struck. In a single violent movement, a leopard seal clamped its powerful jaws around Kirsty's leg and dragged her straight down. Her scream cut through the air, sharp and sudden, before she vanished beneath the surface. The water closed over her instantly, leaving nothing behind but ripples and fractured ice. For several seconds, there was nothing. Her partner rushed toward the spot as the shore party radioed the research station to call for emergency assistance. Then Kirsty burst back through the surface, gasping, but she was not alone. The leopard seal still had her in its grip, its massive body partially visible beneath the ice as it hauled her through the water. In the ocean, leopard seals are not awkward or slow. They are built for speed and control, using their muscular foreflippers to slice through the water with precision. This animal was enormous, later estimated to be nearly 15 feet long, and possibly weighing over 1,200 pounds, almost 10 times Kirsty's body weight. Against a predator of that size, strength alone offered no chance of escape. She fought desperately, kicking and twisting, but the seal pulled her under again and again. For more than 10 minutes, the attack continued. The seal dragged Kirsty beneath the surface repeatedly, holding her underwater, releasing her just long enough for her to struggle upward and then biting down again. Each time, the seal took her deeper, depriving her of oxygen and exhausting what little strength she had left. This was not a single strike. It was sustained, methodical, and relentless. Her partner finally spotted her about 5 meters below the surface, the seal gripping her fin. Kirsty's movements were weak and uncoordinated, a sign that she was running out of air. The seal released her briefly, allowing her body to float upward, only to seize her again and drag her back down into the dark water. Then, the water swallowed her completely. Believing she was lost, her partner swam back to shore, where the rescue boat was already being deployed. The boat raced across Ryder Bay, scanning the ice-filled water for any sign of her. But for long minutes, there was nothing. No bubbles, no movement, no indication of where she had been taken. Nearly 20 minutes after she disappeared, the leopard seal resurfaced almost half a mile away. Kirsty was still in its jaws, being dragged face down across the water, her body limp and unresponsive. As the rescue crew closed in, they feared the animal was attempting to consume her. In a desperate effort to save her, one of the crew members struck the leopard seal with a shovel. The impact startled the animal, and finally, it released her. The crew pulled Kirsty into the boat, immediately beginning CPR as they rushed back toward the research station. For over an hour, her colleagues fought to bring her back, refusing to stop even as hope faded. But despite their efforts, Kirsty Brown was pronounced dead. Later, investigators recovered her dive computer, and what it revealed was deeply unsettling. During the attack, she had been dragged to a depth of 230 feet, 70 meters, far beyond the safe limits for recreational diving. At that depth, even a successful escape could have been fatal. A rapid ascent would have risked catastrophic lung injuries from expanding air, meaning that survival may have been impossible regardless of the outcome. The official cause of death was ruled accidental drowning. In the aftermath, the British Antarctic Survey suspended all diving operations. When activities resumed months later, safety protocols were drastically revised. Divers were now required to observe local wildlife for at least 30 minutes before entering the water, have a support boat present at all times, and use diver-to-surface communication devices. Officials acknowledged that the risks associated with diving near the ice's edge had been far greater than previously understood. Today, a nearby island in Ryder Bay bears her name. Kirsty Island stands as a quiet reminder in frozen waters, honoring a dedicated marine biologist whose work advanced scientific understanding and whose final moments revealed just how unforgiving Antarctica can be. March 5th, 2005 started like any other day at Devil's Den Cave. The sun was bright, the air was crisp, and deep beneath the Earth's surface, something absolutely horrifying was about to unfold. The man had entered Devil's Den Cave earlier that morning, equipped with his headlamp, helmet, and the confidence that comes from experience. He had explored underground systems before. He knew the risks. He understood that subterranean passages could be tight, disorienting, and dangerous. But knowledge and preparation can only protect you so far when you're dealing with the raw, unforgiving geometry of solid rock. He had been making his way through the system for hours, navigating familiar passages and exploring new routes. Devil's Den was a maze of tunnels, some large enough to walk through upright, others requiring him to crouch, crawl, or squeeze through on his belly. Each passage presented its own challenge, its own unique architecture carved by millions of years of water erosion through the limestone. The temperature underground remained constant, cool and damp. Water dripped from stalactites overhead, the sound echoing through chambers in an irregular rhythm that was both peaceful and unsettling. His breath came in steady puffs of condensation in the beam of his headlamp. Everything was going according to plan. Then he found it. A passage he hadn't fully explored before. It looked manageable at the entrance, maybe 2 feet high and 3 feet wide. His headlamp beam disappeared into the darkness ahead, unable to illuminate where the tunnel led. The opening seemed to promise continuation, perhaps opening into a larger chamber beyond. This was the moment where he should have turned back. This was the moment where instinct should have overridden curiosity. But he didn't turn back. He lowered himself onto his stomach and began to crawl forward, using his elbows and knees to propel himself through the narrow passage. The rock pressed against his back and chest, limiting his breathing to shallow gasps. This was normal. This was expected. Underground, you learn to control your breathing, to fight the panic that came from being enclosed by millions of tons of stone pressing down from above. The tunnel continued straight for maybe 15 feet. The walls seemed to tighten slightly, but nothing he couldn't handle. His headlamp scraped against the ceiling, sending small cascades of dust and tiny rock fragments into his eyes. He blinked them away and kept moving forward. Forward was the only option now. The passage was too narrow to turn around. Then the tunnel changed. The passage took a sharp turn. Not a gentle curve, but an abrupt 90-degree angle. An L shape carved into the bedrock, dropping down vertically and twisting to the right. He paused at the intersection, shining his light into the vertical shaft. It looked tight, desperately tight, but he convinced himself it was passable. This is where everything went catastrophically wrong. He committed to the turn. He pushed his head and shoulders into the vertical section, his upper body flat against the stone floor. To navigate the L-shaped passage, he would need to twist his entire body through the intersection. His torso began to rotate as he forced himself deeper into the angular tunnel. His chest made it through. His stomach pressed against the corner where the passage turned. And then he felt it, the resistance. The terrible realization that the geometry of the tunnel didn't match the geometry of his body. He tried to pull himself forward. His legs, still in the horizontal section of the passage, pointed upward and backward. His torso, now committed to the vertical shaft, faced downward. At the intersection, at his waist, his body was twisted 90 degrees. His spine was torqued at an angle no human spine should ever experience. He was simultaneously lying flat on his stomach and standing on his knees, his body bent in a way that defied natural human positioning, and he couldn't move. Not forward, not backward. His body was locked in the L-shaped prison of stone, twisted like a corkscrew at the corner intersection. Every attempt to push forward only wedged him tighter. Every attempt to pull backward was impossible because his legs had no leverage in their upward-pointing position. The rock held him like a vice, unyielding and absolute. Panic set in immediately. His breathing became rapid and shallow, which only made things worse in the confined space. Each breath required his ribs to expand against solid rock. His heart hammered in his chest. The headlamp beam shook as his head trembled, casting wild shadows in the impossibly tight passage. He tried to calm himself. He tried to think logically, but logic offered no solutions. He was stuck in a position that seemed physically impossible to escape from. His body was twisted in a configuration that prevented any normal movement. He couldn't reach his arms back to push against anything. His legs couldn't find purchase to pull himself backward. The corner of the L-shaped passage had become a trap more effective than any mechanism designed by human hands. Time became meaningless. Minutes felt like hours. His muscles began to ache from the unnatural position. His twisted torso made breathing increasingly difficult. The weight of the earth above him seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, as if the cave itself was slowly crushing him deeper into its stone embrace. He was alone. Deep underground, trapped in a position so absurd, so geometrically improbable, that even if he could scream for help, he wasn't sure anyone would believe his predicament. Above ground, someone had noticed his vehicle in the parking area. Hours had passed since anyone had seen him. Park rangers were alerted. They knew someone was underground. They knew Devil's Den Cave, and they knew that tight passages in that system could be unforgiving. The Rangers entered the cave system, moving quickly but carefully through the passages. They called out, their voices echoing through the chambers. Somewhere deep in the system, the trapped man heard those distant calls. Hope surged through him, giving him renewed energy to try to signal his position. The Rangers followed the most likely route based on their knowledge of the cave. They squeezed through passage after passage, their own headlamps cutting through the darkness. Then, one of them spotted it. The narrow horizontal tunnel. The one that seemed to lead nowhere. The ranger approached and peered inside. His light revealed the impossible sight. A pair of legs, knees bent, pointing upward in the horizontal passage. And somewhere beyond, in the vertical shaft, the rest of the man's body, twisted and trapped. The cave rescue team had been called, specialists trained for exactly this kind of nightmare scenario. But the Rangers knew time was critical. The man's breathing was labored. His body was twisted in a position that could cause serious injury. They had to act immediately. What followed was a delicate, agonizing process. The Rangers couldn't simply pull him out. His body was wedged and twisted in a way that required careful manipulation. They had to work in the confined space themselves, reaching in to assess exactly how he was positioned. They began to work on freeing his legs first, trying to give them room to maneuver. Inch by inch, they manipulated his lower body, trying to untwist the terrible corkscrew configuration that held him. The man endured waves of pain as his body was shifted and adjusted in the tight confines. The Rangers worked with incredible patience and skill. They understood the cave's geometry. They understood human anatomy, and somehow, through a combination of technique, determination, and perhaps sheer luck, they found the exact sequence of movements needed to reverse his entry into the trap. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to extract him. His legs were straightened, his torso was untwisted. His body was carefully pulled backward through the L-shaped passage, reversing the nightmare journey that had imprisoned him. When they finally pulled him free from the narrow passage and into a larger chamber, he could barely process what had happened. His body ached. His muscles trembled from hours of tension and unnatural positioning, but he was free. The Rangers helped him through the cave system and back to the surface. By the time the specialized cave rescue team arrived, ready for a complex extraction operation, the man was already out. The Rangers had accomplished what seemed impossible. March 5th, 2005, ended very differently than it had begun. The man who entered Devil's Den Cave that morning had learned a terrible lesson about the unforgiving nature of stone, about the limits of human body mechanics, and about how quickly exploration can turn into entrapment. The official report would be brief. A man became stuck in a tight passage. Park rangers freed him before the rescue team arrived. No other details necessary. But those who were there, who saw the impossible position he was trapped in, who witnessed the delicate extraction from the L-shaped nightmare, they knew the truth. They knew how close it had come to being a very different kind of story. The kind that ends not with rescue, but with recovery. Devil's Den Cave remains open to exploration. The L-shaped passage is still there, waiting in the darkness. A geometric trap carved by nature, indifferent to human suffering, patient as only stone can be. Anthony Wayne Arisman entered the cave in Wayne County, Kentucky on the morning of May 8, 2016, as he had done on many previous occasions, with no sense that this particular visit would end differently from the others. He was a man who valued solitude and routine, and the cave had become for him a place of deliberate retreat rather than exploration. A stable environment whose fixed temperature, silence, and isolation offered a form of order that the surface world rarely provided. His preparation followed a pattern that had been refined through repetition, beginning with a careful selection of layered clothing intended to conserve heat in an environment where the temperature never rose, followed by the inspection of his helmet, his headlamp, his spare lights, and the batteries that powered them. He packed modest supplies, not for a long expedition, but for a solitary visit whose duration he believed he could control. When he crossed the threshold and passed into the entrance, the daylight narrowed and vanished behind him, replaced by the constant dimness of stone illuminated only by the narrow cone of his headlamp. The sounds of wind and birds ended abruptly, leaving only the muted echoes of his own footsteps and the faint drip of water that traveled unseen through the cave's interior. The temperature dropped to its constant underground level, and the air settled around him with the cool stillness that had drawn him back so many times before. For the first portion of the descent, his movements followed established habit. He walked passages he recognized by memory rather than by conscious navigation, paused at familiar bends, and followed slopes whose angles he knew from experience. His pace remained even, conserving energy, and his breathing remained controlled, measured against the demands of the terrain. He allowed himself to move without urgency, trusting the knowledge he had built over years of solitary visits. After some time, he reached a junction that differed subtly from his recollection. Instead of turning back toward the route he normally followed, he chose a passage that sloped gently downward and moved into it without hesitation. The ceiling lowered, narrowing the vertical space above him, and the walls pressed closer. But none of this alarmed him. The cave in this region always constricted and widened unpredictably, and he continued forward, allowing the passage to curve away from the familiar network he had intended to follow. When he eventually stopped and turned around, the shape of the passage behind him did not match the image he carried in memory. He continued forward rather than reversing, convinced that the route would soon reconnect with a known section of the system. From this point onward, the cave ceased to behave as a familiar place. The passages began to repeat themselves in form and dimension, each bend opening into another corridor of nearly identical width and height. The walls marked by the same pale limestone and darker seams of clay. Landmarks that had once distinguished one chamber from another lost their meaning as repetition dissolved orientation. He moved more slowly now, scanning the walls carefully, counting turns, fixing small details in memory as he constructed a new mental map. He stopped and retraced his steps. The junction he expected to find did not appear. He selected another passage and followed it, only to arrive in a corridor that offered no recognition and no clear indication of direction. He returned again. At this stage, he understood with certainty that he was no longer oriented within the system. He did not panic. He remained methodical. He marked the floor with the toe of his boot and used touch to fix his position in the immediate space around him. From that point, he chose one passage and followed it for several minutes, then returned to his mark, then chose another, and then another, attempting to impose order on a cave that resisted all effort to distinguish one route from the next. Time passed steadily. The temperature pressed into his clothing without change. The stone drew heat from his body at a constant rate. His breathing grew heavier as he increased his pace, then slowed again as he forced himself to conserve energy. He checked his lights and replaced a weakening battery, then continued deeper into the network of passages. Eventually, one of his lights failed completely. He switched to another without stopping. This reduced his margin of safety. From this moment onward, he no longer explored. He searched. He followed any passage that rose slightly, avoided those that descended, tested the walls and floor for air movement that might indicate proximity to an exit, and paused frequently to listen for any distant sound of water or airflow. None appeared. The cave remained sealed, silent, and uniform. Hours passed. His movements grew slower as fatigue accumulated. The second light dimmed, and he began to ration its use, turning it off when he stopped and activating it only when he moved. He limited his progress to what he believed necessary, preserving energy and power. When the final light failed, darkness closed around him completely. This darkness did not soften or shift. It remained absolute, without outline, without gradient, without relief. He stopped moving and lowered himself to the cave floor. He placed his hands against the walls and floor to locate himself in the small volume of space around his body. He did not attempt blind movement, understanding that any fall, collision, or misstep in this environment would end any remaining chance of survival. He remained still, preserving strength. Cold entered his body steadily. The stone beneath him absorbed warmth without interruption. He removed his gloves and pressed his hands against his chest. Then he removed his outer jacket and folded it carefully beside him. At this point, he prepared fire. Later examination of the cave floor established the method with clarity. He used a lighter. He tore narrow strips from his jacket and ignited them one at a time, feeding the flame slowly, controlling it carefully, allowing it to burn only as long as necessary to warm his hands, his chest, and the core of his body. When the fire died, he waited until the cold returned, then ignited another strip. This process continued for hours. He burned each layer in deliberate sequence, calculating what he could afford to lose and what he had to keep. Using each fire to delay the advance of hypothermia, he burned his shirt, then his pants, then his underlayers, conserving what remained and using each fire only when the cold became unbearable. His movement slowed as his body weakened. Coordination in his hands deteriorated. He removed his boots and burned the laces, then the lining, then the fabric panels. When nothing remained, he removed the last of his clothing and burned it as well. Now, naked, he sat on the cave floor, surrounded by ash and scorched fragments of fabric. There was nothing left to burn. Cold entered his body without resistance. His muscles weakened beyond control. His posture failed. He lay down on the stone. His breathing slowed and his consciousness started fading. On the surface, the day passed quietly, and for many hours there was nothing to suggest that anything unusual had happened. When evening came and Anthony Wayne Arisman still had not returned, concern began to grow among the people who knew his habits, because he had never stayed away this long without letting someone know. Friends drove to the familiar cave entrance and found his vehicle still parked where he had left it, which made it immediately clear that he had gone inside and had not come back out. Realizing that beyond that point, the cave became a maze of tunnels that could easily confuse even experienced people, they contacted rescue teams and asked for help from local caving experts who knew the system well and understood how easily someone could become lost inside it. When the search began, the rescuers entered slowly and carefully, fully equipped, and still hoping that they might find him alive. Not far inside the cave, they came across the first burned fragment of clothing, then another, and then more, each piece lying a little farther in and quietly marking the path he had taken. They followed this trail deeper into the cave, finding his helmet next, then his lights, both drained and useless, until finally, deep within the system, they reached the place where his body lay. Arisman was lying naked on the stone floor, completely still, and without any obvious injuries. There were no broken bones, no bleeding, and no visible signs of trauma. Later, the coroner confirmed that there were no external injuries and no indication that the cave had crushed him, trapped him, or struck him in any way. It had simply taken him away from the surface, drawn the warmth from his body, and waited. Anthony Wayne Arisman died not from violence, not from a collapse, and not from a sudden accident, but from becoming lost in a place that shows little mercy to anyone who loses their way. And until the very end, he fought it with planning, discipline, and reason. July 15th, 2016. 4 teenage boys gathered in the peaceful Wiltshire countryside, their eyes glued to their phone screens instead of the beautiful landscape around them. They were hunting Pokemon, those anime creatures that had taken over the world just weeks after the game's UK launch. Pokemon Go had done something no other game had managed. It dragged millions of people off their couches and sent them wandering through parks, monuments, and random street corners, chasing monsters that only existed on their screens. But these 4 boys weren't hunting in parks or on street corners. Their phones were pointing them towards something else entirely, a dark opening in the hillside that looked like nothing more than a hole in the ground. The app suggested there might be rare Pokemon inside, the kind you couldn't find anywhere else. And to teenagers obsessed with catching them all, that was all the invitation they needed. They had no real caving gear, no proper lights, no ropes, no helmets, no maps. Just 4 smartphones with batteries that were already ticking down. And that stubborn teenage confidence that says nothing bad is going to happen to us. In their heads, it wasn't a mine. It was a quick in-and-out adventure. A few hours underground, snag a couple Pokemon, then back to daylight. They were probably even picturing the same thing the old Game Boy Pokemon games taught all of us to expect from caves. Rock and ground-type Pokemons hiding in the dark, like the mine was just a real-life version of one of those routes you clear and escape using a rope item or move dig when stuck or lost. Well, real-life caves aren't like that. The kids walked through the entrance and stepped into the box mines. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't have understood from looking at that innocent-seeming entrance, was that they had just entered one of the most dangerous underground labyrinths in England. The box mines weren't some small cave system you could explore in an afternoon. This was a man-made nightmare stretching across 72 square miles of underground passages. 72 square miles. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of a small city, except instead of streets and buildings, it's nothing but tunnels. Thousands upon thousands of passages that branch and twist and loop back on themselves. Junctions appearing every few hundred feet, each offering 3 or 4 different routes that all look exactly the same. Corridors carved through gray limestone that repeat endlessly until your brain can't tell one section from another. Experienced cave explorers who've spent years exploring these mines treat them with deadly seriousness, bringing redundant lighting systems, detailed maps, GPS devices, and the knowledge that one wrong turn in here can mean death. People have died in the box mines. Others have been lost for days before rescue teams manage to extract them. This isn't a place you wander into casually, but these 4 boys didn't know any of that. They were just following their phones into what looked like an adventure. The entrance section felt manageable at first. It always does. The first 100 feet of passage seemed harmless enough, almost disappointing. They kept walking, making turns that seemed random but felt fine in the moment. Left at this junction, straight through the next one, right when the passage split. The phones kept working, still displaying the Pokemon Go interface, still suggesting there might be Pokemons to catch just a little further ahead. Each decision to go deeper seemed harmless because the passage ahead always looked walkable, always looked like something they could easily backtrack through. That's the insidious thing about getting lost in places like this. There's never one dramatic moment where you realize you've made a terrible mistake. It happens gradually, through 100 small choices that individually seem fine, but collectively create a route so complex that retracing it becomes impossible. The boys didn't notice when they crossed the line from exploring to lost. They just kept making turns, kept following passages, kept going deeper into a labyrinth that was systematically erasing any mental map they were trying to build. At some point, maybe after an hour, maybe less, one of them suggested they should head back. And that's when the creeping horror began, because none of them could agree on which direction back was. The passages all looked identical. Every junction seemed familiar and completely alien at the same time. They couldn't remember if they had turned left or right at that intersection. Couldn't recall if they'd passed through this particular chamber before, or if it just looked like the 12 other chambers they had seen. They were lost. Completely, utterly lost in a 72 square mile underground maze, approximately 100 feet below the surface, where their voices wouldn't reach anyone, and where the summer sunshine might as well have been on another planet. The realization hit them in stages. First confusion, then concern, then the cold grip of real fear as they understood their situation. They were trapped in an abandoned mine system with no idea how to get out, and the phones that had led them down here were now almost useless. No cell signal. The thick rock overhead killed any connection to the outside world. The phones still worked as flashlights, still displayed the Pokemon Go game mockingly on their screens, but they couldn't call for help, couldn't text their parents, couldn't reach anyone who might know they were missing. The boys found a passage and started crawling, desperately hoping to stumble onto something recognizable. But the box mines don't reward hope or luck. Every passage they chose led to more passages. Every junction offered new choices that felt equally wrong. Their minds began running through worst-case scenarios, dying from hypothermia in the constant chill, batteries dying and leaving them in absolute darkness, wandering until exhaustion took them, bodies never found in the endless maze. They kept moving because stopping felt like giving up, even though every turn might be taking them further from safety. The psychological weight of being trapped underground is difficult to describe. It's not just fear of physical danger, but the crushing awareness that you're in a place humans aren't meant to be. Hours passed in that underground purgatory. The boys made turn after turn, crawled through passage after passage. Then they entered a chamber that felt different from the endless repetitive tunnels they'd been navigating. This space was larger, much larger. The ceiling rose higher above them, and the walls spread wider. They were in the cathedral. It was one of the few distinctive features in the vast sameness of the box mines, a chamber that actually felt different enough to serve as a landmark. And in that chamber, something miraculous happened. One of the phones, its battery probably nearly dead, its signal indicator having shown nothing but no service for hours, suddenly caught a flicker of cellular signal. Not a strong signal, not something reliable, just a weak, intermittent connection. The boys immediately called emergency services. The call went through. Someone answered. For the first time in hours, they had contact with the outside world. "We're lost in the box mines. We can't find the way out. We're about 100 feet underground and we don't know where we are." That was all they could provide. No specific location within the 72 square mile network. No useful landmarks. Just the desperate plea for help from 4 teenagers who thought they might die down there. The call reached Dorset and Wiltshire Fire and Rescue, and the responders immediately understood they were dealing with a serious emergency. 4 teenagers with no caving experience trapped in one of the most complex underground systems in the region, with no equipment and no way to navigate out on their own. The fire service contacted local mine experts, people who had spent years exploring and mapping the box system, who understood its layout in ways that only come from extensive experience. Without these guides, the rescue would have been nearly impossible, because you can't just tell someone, follow the main passage, when there are thousands of passages that all look like main passages. The rescue operation organized quickly. Water and radio equipment were prepared to lower down to the boys once their approximate location was determined. Rescue teams entered the box mines guided by the local experts who knew the system's secrets. These weren't random searchers hoping to stumble onto 4 lost boys in 72 square miles of tunnels. These were people who could navigate the maze, who knew which junctions led where, who could mentally map the 3-dimensional labyrinth and find their way to the cathedral chamber where the boys were waiting. The boys heard voices approaching through the passages and felt an overwhelming relief. After hours of believing they might never see daylight again, rescue had arrived. The teams reached them, assessed their condition, cold, exhausted, scared but physically unharmed, and began the extraction. The journey out was long even with expert guides leading the way. The boys followed their rescuers through junction after junction, through passages they never would have found on their own, along routes that required knowledge these teenagers simply didn't have. They emerged into late afternoon sunlight after spending hours in the perpetual darkness underground. The boys were glum and embarrassed, facing the reality that their casual Pokemon hunt had turned into a major rescue operation involving fire services, mine experts, and emergency coordinators. And here's the part that turns this from near tragedy to a straight-up Darwin Awards audition. They didn't catch a single Pokemon down there, not one. They wandered into a 72 square mile underground maze, nearly became headline material, and the only thing they caught was panic, a dying battery bar, and the embarrassing realization that the Pokemon they risked their lives for weren't even spawning in that mine.